I worked for 37 years as a high school librarian, and in all that time, I never once bounced a check. Not one. I clipped coupons when my children were small, drove the same Buick for 11 years, packed my lunch every single day, and when my husband passed away 6 years ago, I sat alone at the kitchen table with every account statement spread out in front of me and thought, you are going to be okay. I had my teacher's pension coming in at $7,800 a month. I had the house, fully paid off. I had a savings account that made my financial advisor smile whenever I walked through his door. I tell you all of this because I need you to understand what I had before I tell you what I almost lost. My son is 34 years old. He has my husband's eyes and his grandmother's stubbornness, and when he was 17, he told me he wanted to study business. I was proud. I helped pay for his degree. I watched him walk across that stage and thought, your father would have cried. What I did not think, what never once crossed my mind, was that 11 years later, that business degree would be used against me in my own kitchen. His girlfriend moved in with him about 2 years ago. I had only met her 4 or 5 times before that, always at holiday dinners, always polite, always asking me questions about myself in the way that people do when they are performing interest rather than feeling it. She worked in property management. She knew about contracts. She knew about paperwork. I did not think much about any of that at the time. It started the way these things always start, slowly, quietly, in the language of love. My son called me on a Tuesday evening in late October and said his car had broken down. The repair estimate was $2,200. He asked if I could help. I said yes without hesitation, because that is what mothers do, and I wired the money that same afternoon. 3 weeks later, he called again. His girlfriend had a business idea, a property rental investment, something about converting a duplex, and they just needed a little seed money to get started. Could I help? Just $8,000, he said. Just to get things moving. He would pay me back within the year. I hesitated that time. Not long, maybe a day, but I did hesitate. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, looking out at my backyard, at the oak tree my husband planted the year our daughter was born, and thinking, is this right? But then I called my son back and said yes, because I trusted him, because he was my child, because I had spent 37 years helping young people find what they needed, and I was not about to stop doing that for my own flesh and blood. The $8,000 became $12,000 when the renovation ran over budget. The $12,000 became $19,000 when there were permits involved, unexpected ones, and the contractor needed to be paid. Each time, my son had a precise and reasonable-sounding explanation. Each time, I said yes. Then came the Sunday afternoon in February, when they both came over for lunch, and my son's girlfriend set a manila folder on the table next to the salad bowl and said, in the brightest voice imaginable, we had an idea that could actually help protect you. I remember looking at that folder. I remember thinking it was strange that she had brought it to a lunch. She explained that since I was managing my finances alone, it might give me peace of mind to have someone I trusted handle the day-to-day, not take over. She was very clear about that word, not take over, just assist, just be available. She had drafted a durable power of attorney, she said. Standard language. Her cousin was a notary. They could have it done by the end of the week. My son reached across the table and put his hand over mine and said, Mom, we just want to make sure you're protected. You've been doing everything alone for 6 years. Let us help. I want to be honest with you about something. I was not senile. I was not confused. I was not having a bad day. I was a 71-year-old woman who had just eaten a bowl of tomato soup in her own kitchen, and I signed that document because my son asked me to, and I loved him. That is the whole truth of it. Not because I was old, not because I was weak, because I loved him, and I believed he loved me back. The changes were not immediate. That is what I want people to understand. If they had emptied my account the next morning, I would have known. Instead, it happened like weather, a slow pressure drop before a storm that you don't notice until the temperature has already changed. The first thing I noticed was that my debit card was declined at the pharmacy in March. I assumed it was a bank error. I called the branch, and a very patient young man told me that the account had been restructured and that all transactions above $200 now required secondary authorization. I did not understand what that meant. I asked him to explain it again. He told me that whoever held power of attorney on the account had added that restriction. He gave me a number to call. I called my son instead. He explained that it was just a safeguard. He would authorize anything I needed. I just had to ask. He said it so gently that I almost felt grateful. I am not proud of that. By April, my monthly household allowance, the money I was permitted to spend from my own $7,800 pension without submitting a request, was $400. $400. For groceries, gas, utilities I hadn't already set up on autopay, and anything else that came up. The rest was being managed and invested and allocated toward the duplex project, which I had never formally agreed to fund in full, but which had, apparently, become my primary financial obligation. I submitted requests. Sometimes they were approved within a day. Sometimes it took 4 or 5 days, and during those windows I found myself counting what was left in my wallet and making decisions about whether I needed bread more than I needed the prescription that kept my blood pressure in range. I am telling you this not for sympathy. I am telling you because I want you to feel the specific humiliation of asking permission to spend your own money, in your own home, in the 6th decade of your life. I started keeping a notebook. This is the part of the story where I need you to understand that I was not sitting passively waiting to be rescued. I had been a librarian. I knew how to research. I knew how to document. And I knew, in the slow-growing certainty that had been building since February, that something was very wrong. Every time I submitted a request and received a response, I wrote it down. Every time my son mentioned the property, the investment, the bigger plan, I wrote it down. I printed bank statements when I could access them. Access was sometimes restricted, I was told, due to security updates, and I stored them in a shoebox on the top shelf of my bedroom closet behind my winter sweaters. My daughter did not know any of this. She lives in Portland, works in healthcare administration, has 2 children under 10, and a life that runs at full speed from Monday to Sunday. We spoke on the phone every week or two, and every time she asked how I was doing, I said fine. I said fine because I did not want to worry her. I said fine because I was still trying to believe that this was a misunderstanding, that my son was careless but not cruel, that the man who used to fall asleep in my lap during thunderstorms when he was 5 years old was not deliberately starving me of my own resources. But in the first week of June, I ran out of that particular hope. I had submitted a request for $340 to cover 3 weeks of groceries plus a copay. The request sat unanswered for 6 days. On the 7th day, I drove to the grocery store with $47 in cash and walked every aisle making calculations. That night, I ate crackers and peanut butter for dinner. The following morning, I opened my refrigerator and stood in front of it for a long time looking at what was left. A jar of mustard, 2 eggs, a half-empty container of yogurt with a date that made me uncertain. I closed the refrigerator. I sat down in my living room and I did not turn on the lights. I do not know exactly how long I sat there. I remember the light changing from afternoon to evening outside the window. I remember thinking about my husband, about what he would say if he could see me sitting in the dark in the house we had paid off together, with $7,800 of my own money disappearing somewhere I could no longer see. That is when my daughter walked in. She had driven down from Portland without telling me, because she said later that something in my voice the week before had made her uneasy. She had her own key. She came in through the front door and found me sitting in the armchair with no lights on. She turned on the lamp and looked at me and said, "Mom, what's going on?" I told her I was just resting. She walked to the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator. She closed it. She opened the pantry. She closed that too. Then she came back and stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not quite anger, not quite fear, but something that sat directly between them. She said, "Mom, you get $7,800 a month. Why is there nothing in this house to eat?" And I started to cry. Not because I was fragile, because I had been holding it alone for 4 months and she was the first person who had asked the right question. I showed her the notebook. She sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours going through every page. She did not interrupt me while I talked. She did not tell me I should have said something sooner. She just read and highlighted, and when she was finished, she set the notebook down flat on the table with her hand on top of it and said, "Mom, I'm going to make some calls in the morning. Tonight, we're going to the grocery store." We went to the grocery store at 9 o'clock at night. She paid for everything herself, and I pushed the cart and I cried again in the cereal aisle, quietly, and she pretended not to notice, which was exactly the right thing to do. The following morning, My daughter made 3 phone calls before 9 a.m. The first was to a family law attorney in town who handled elder financial abuse cases. The attorney said she could see us at noon. The second was to my bank, where my daughter identified herself, explained the situation, and asked what documentation would be needed to have the power of attorney revoked and full account access restored to me. The banker, a woman who was professional and unhurried, and who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, walked my daughter through the exact process. A durable power of attorney, she explained, can be revoked by the principal at any time, in writing, as long as the principal is competent. I was competent. I had always been competent. I just had not known I could take it back. The third call was to my son, which my daughter made on speakerphone so I could hear, with her hand resting on mine across the table. She told him she was in town. She told him she had seen my accounts. She said, very calmly, that she had spoken to an attorney and that we had an appointment that afternoon. She said she was giving him the opportunity to come to that meeting and explain himself, or to not come, and have the attorney do the explaining for him. There was a long pause on the phone. Then he said, "This is being blown out of proportion." My daughter looked at me. I looked at my notebook on the table. She said, "Be at the attorney's office at noon," and hung up. The attorney's office was downtown, on the second floor of a building that had once been a hardware store. She was in her late 40s, direct, with reading glasses she kept taking off and putting back on while she reviewed documents. I had brought the shoebox. My daughter had photographed every page of the notebook that morning and emailed them to herself as backup. The attorney looked at the power of attorney document my son's girlfriend had drafted. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up and said, "This is not standard language." There was a clause, buried in the middle of the document in smaller text than the rest, that authorized the agent, my son's girlfriend, to make investment decisions on my behalf, including the use of real property as collateral. My house. The house my husband and I had paid off together. It had been listed as potential collateral for a business loan my son had apparently been negotiating with a private lender for the past 4 months. I have felt many things in my 71 years. I have felt grief and joy and exhaustion and pride and the specific quiet contentment of a Sunday afternoon with nowhere to be. What I felt sitting in that attorney's office, reading that clause, was something I do not have a clean word for. It was not anger, exactly. It was the feeling of a door being opened in a house you thought you knew, revealing a room you never knew existed, full of things that were never supposed to be there. My son arrived 20 minutes late. He came alone. His girlfriend, it turned out, had taken the morning to consult her own attorney. My son sat down across from me, and the attorney, and my daughter, and he did not look at me for the first several minutes. He looked at the table. He looked at the window. He looked at his own hands. The attorney explained, without raising her voice, what she had found. She explained what elder financial abuse meant under Oregon law. She explained what criminal exposure looked like when a family member exploited a power of attorney to access a senior's pension for personal business ventures and to encumber property without explicit informed consent. My son said, "I was going to pay everything back." My daughter said, "With what?" He didn't answer. The attorney told him that I would be filing a formal revocation of the power of attorney that afternoon. She told him that I would be contacting my bank to restore full account control and remove all spending restrictions. She told him that the private lender his girlfriend had been in contact with regarding my property would be notified that the authorization to use my home as collateral had been obtained fraudulently and was therefore void. She also told him that what he and his girlfriend had done met the legal standard for financial elder abuse in the state, and that while it was ultimately my decision whether to pursue criminal charges, the civil remedies available to me were significant, and she intended to pursue every one of them. He cried, "I want to be honest about that too." He put his face in his hands and cried at the conference table. And there was a part of me, the part that watched him sleep when he was small, the part that held his hand at his father's funeral, that wanted to reach across the table. But I kept my hands in my lap, because the man crying across from me had watched me eat crackers alone for dinner and had not answered my phone calls for 6 days, and those 2 things lived inside me now alongside all the others, and I was not ready to let go of them yet. The revocation was filed that afternoon. The bank meeting took place the next morning. My daughter sat beside me while a branch manager walked through the account history line by line. Over the preceding 4 months, $31,400 had been transferred out of my accounts in increments. small enough to avoid automatic flags. $2,000 here, $3,000, $500 there, never two large transfers in the same week. Of that amount, $22,000 had gone directly into a business account held jointly by my son and his girlfriend. The remaining $9,400 had been transferred to the private lender as a preliminary good faith deposit on the loan negotiation involving my property. The banker flagged the account for the bank's internal fraud team and referred the matter to them directly. My daughter filed a formal complaint with Oregon's Department of Justice Elder Financial Abuse Division that same afternoon. She did it from her laptop at my kitchen table while I made us both tea. I watched her type, and I thought about the notebook in my shoebox, about every date and amount and phone call I had written down in my careful librarian's handwriting, and I was glad fiercely, quietly glad that I had documented all of it. The civil case was settled 8 months later. My son and his girlfriend were required to repay the full $31,400, plus attorney's fees and costs. The settlement also included a formal legal agreement that neither of them would ever again hold any financial authority over my affairs. The private lender, once presented with documentation of the fraudulent authorization, withdrew their claim on my property entirely. The district attorney reviewed the file and chose to pursue criminal charges. My son's girlfriend was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. My son accepted a plea agreement that included 2 years of supervised probation, mandatory financial counseling, and community service. He has not been to my house since the day of that meeting, and I have not called him, and I do not yet know what the future of that relationship looks like. I hold that not knowing the way you hold something fragile carefully, without squeezing. My daughter stayed for 3 weeks that summer. She repainted the kitchen, which I had been meaning to do for 2 years. We watched old movies in the evenings and ate dinner at the table every night and talked about her father, which we had not done enough of since he passed. On the last morning before she drove back to Portland, she sat across from me with her coffee and said, "Mum, I want to talk to you about a few things." She had done her research. She told me about representative payees and limited POA arrangements with built-in oversight, about elder law attorneys who specialize in structuring financial protections that don't require giving up control. She told me about a financial advisor in town who specialized in working with widowed retirees and who had a fee-only structure that meant he had no incentive to sell me products I didn't need. She had already looked him up and confirmed he was legitimate. Then she said, "I also want you to know that what happened was not because you were naive or old or incapable. It happened because someone you loved took advantage of your trust. That is about him, not you." I have thought about those words many times since then. I am 72 years old now. I live in my house, the one with the oak tree in the backyard that my husband planted the year my daughter was born. My pension comes in on the 1st of every month and goes where I direct it, and I direct it with full information and complete authority. I have a new attorney who reviewed all my estate documents and updated them properly. I have a financial advisor I meet with quarterly who shows me every statement and explains every line. I have a debit card that works at the pharmacy. What I also have, and this is the part I did not expect, is a different kind of clarity. When you have sat in a dark room in your own home and understood what it means to lose control of your own life, you come out of that room with a very precise understanding of what matters and what does not. I am not afraid anymore in the way I was afraid during those months. Not of aging, not of being alone, not of managing my affairs without help. I know what I am capable of. I have the notebook to prove it. I kept it, by the way. The shoebox is still on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, behind my winter sweaters. I don't know exactly why I kept it. Maybe because every page of it is evidence of something I did right, even in the middle of everything going wrong. Maybe because I want to remember that I was paying attention, that I wrote it all down, that when my daughter walked in and turned on the light and asked me the right question, I already had the answer ready. If you are watching this and you have a parent who is aging, please check in. Not just with a phone call that lasts 5 minutes between other things. Really check in. Ask to see the account. Ask who has access to what. Ask if they can spend their own money without permission. Ask what's in the refrigerator. These questions feel intrusive until the day they feel like exactly the right thing. And if you are watching this and you are the parent, if some part of this story sounds familiar in ways that are uncomfortable, please hear me when I tell you that your instincts are correct. The hesitation you feel before signing is real. The unease you push down because you love your child is real. It is possible to love your child completely and also to protect yourself from them. Those two things are not in conflict. I know that now. I saved carefully. I invested wisely. I raised 2 children and buried a husband and showed up to work for 37 years in a building full of young people who needed someone in their corner. I am not a woman who sits in the dark. I just forgot that for a little while. I remember now.